All right, everybody, welcome to Coffee and the Crusades, also known as Ask Me Anything About the Crusades, where we discuss all things Crusades history, medieval history, and just generally anything that you guys want to talk about. So, welcome. We've got Sir Knight Jonathan Phelps in here saying, I would love to see a video on the Latin Empire. That would be kind of interesting. Now, Jonathan, you may know this. If you go to the Attila Total War Medieval Kingdoms mod, they have a really excellent Latin Empire faction that just looks really, really outstanding. Really outstanding. It's actually my favorite looking faction from the Medieval Kingdoms 1212 mod. So I need to just make some clips of just that faction. It just looks so good. So hello, everybody. And apparently it's afternoon in the land of the Norsemen in Sweden, the domain of the Vikings who settled in Kiev, however you want to say it, and founded the Kievan Rus. Okay, we've got a name I can't pronounce, Berzel. How's it going? Thanks for being here. We've got Lambert. How's it going, Lambert? We've got Zenix from Croatia. And everybody's here. So let's just jump into some questions. So we've got a question and we got Chris, who tries to pretend that his name is Bahamut. We know who you are, Chris. And we got Tom. Okay. So Lambert asks, what is your next video? You guys can help me with that. I'm actually, so I just put out this long documentary about Richard the Lionheart when he was imprisoned, where I did not pull any punches. I just said what I thought about Philip II and Heinrich VI. And Tom also says hi. Hello, Tom. So now the next thing is going to be more subdued, I'm sure, a little bit more straightforward. Or not, I guess the Richard video was straightforward, more subtle, I guess we'll say. The Richard the Lionheart in prison video was not subtle. It was over the top. But that was somewhat intentional, just to kind of shake things up a bit on the channel. So in terms of the next video topic, you guys can kind of tell me what you think would be a good one. I'm kind of going back and forth between doing something like a long documentary looking at the early history of the Crusader states. So it would a good title would be After the First Crusade. So the establishment of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the County of Tripoli and the Principality of Antioch, the early Crusader states, kind of maybe leading up into the Second Crusade, maybe make it a pretty long and epic one. So a couple months from now, that would be done. What do you guys think about that? The other idea I had, which is something I've been wanting to do for a long time, but I haven't done, is something about Ireland's Viking Age. So the Viking invasions of Ireland, kind of leading up to Brian Boru. What do you guys think about that? And, here's my dilemma with these two topics. On the one hand, I feel like I've done a lot of stuff about the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Crusader states, so that might be a bit of a, kind of continuing with something I've been doing for years. Although I think this would be kind of my definitive statement on it. It would be a full documentary. It'd be long, plenty of animated maps, all that kind of good stuff. Whereas the Ireland thing would be something new, something very fresh for me, kind of diving into something that I really haven't done much at all about. It's just something I've read about. So I know I'm going to do both, and I'm sure that ultimately one or the other will be the next one, and then I'll do the other one after that. But I'm kind of trying to decide which one to jump into next, because these documentaries take a long time to make. So, you kind of commit yourself to that period of history for a good month or so. So I don't know. I'm leaning toward the Ireland one just to kind of really shake things up and get into a different world, and maybe touch on something that people have not seen from my channel in a long time. And after that, jump into the Crusader states, more in the midsummer era of this year. So here we are. Coffee and the Crusades. You guys are going to drive the conversation. That's what we do here. We talk about whatever you guys want to talk about. So ask any questions you want, and I will try to give some kind of reasonable answer, or just get the conversation going, because sometimes we get really good answers from you guys. So that's always good. All right. So Alexander, how did the Pope and other Catholics react to the fact that a lot of the nobility in the Kingdom of Jerusalem were Eastern Christians? Well, to be fair, and I apologize, guys, my allergies are it's that time of year. But to be fair, Alexander, I mean, they were Latin Christians. The nobles were members of the Latin Christian Church. Some of them had Eastern Christian heritage, but I don't get any sense that it was really a big deal from the perspective of the Pope. I think that it was just kind of the way things were. And the Latin Church was always, at the top of things in the Crusader states. So even though there was a lot of room for, that kind of Eastern heritage being a part of things. I mean, we definitely see that if you go into the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem today, you can see the mosaics from the Crusader period. They have Latin and Greek inscription. They have kind of a Eastern mosaic feel to them. Lambert says he'd be interested in an in-depth profile Baldwin III and his reign. That would be very good. I think that would be a good one to cover within kind of this history of the Crusader states. And my thinking, guys, is it would be good to have a long documentary about that period between the First and Second Crusades. That one could be called After the First Crusade or something like that. And then do another one that's kind of that period after the Second Crusade and leading up to the Battle of Hattin. Well, leading up to the reign of Baldwin IV, because I did this in-depth thing about Baldwin IV. So I don't think I would need to recover that much. But that would be kind of the period when they were trying to take over Egypt, the invasion of Egypt by Amalric during the 1160s, early 1170s. All right. So Tom votes for the documentary on the immediate events after the First Crusade. Tom says they both sound awesome. Zenek says more late crusading content could be really good to have on the bucket list, but I may be biased given Croatia smacked the Ottomans around constantly. Yeah, I hear you. I want to do something more in the Ottoman period. I tell you what, guys, that's the problem with making YouTube videos about history, is what to do next. I love it all. There's so much history I love. I mean, too much history and too little time. That's the problem. What do you do? I need like teams of people to make each one of these for me. Like, okay, you do the Ottomans, you do the Irish Viking age, you do, kind of like, I need a real Crusades history corporation. But no, it's one guy in a computer. Tom Griffin, including the first Crusaders' return to Europe and accounts of how they were received back home. Yes, that would be very good. So that would, at the risk of really kind of expanding things quite a bit. But yeah, and then the Knights of St. Lazarus. I know I don't know it seems like, is it you, Tom, or like several people who kind of want to hear about the Knights of St. Lazarus a lot? I have not run across much material about them. That would be interesting, though. For example, I don't think William of Tyre really mentions them much. Maybe he does once or twice. I'll have to look that up in his chronicle. Alexander, were the Northern Crusades equally connected to those in the Holy Land as the Reconquista was? Yeah, I mean, it was, that's the thing about these three theaters. People sometimes think, oh, well, okay, there were multiple theaters, but wasn't the Holy Land, that was the real Crusades, right? Not from the way people thought of it back then. They really, it's like if it was a crusade, it was a crusade. And all the stuff that went along with that. Part of the feature of these different theaters is that they all had military orders involved in them. A lot of them had local forces who had their own military orders. I mean, obviously the Teutonic Knights kind of became a localized Prussian type of force, even though they had roots in the Holy Land. And they all had the indulgence attached to them too. And even there was also kind of this very real sense for the Teutonic Knights that they had this idea that they were fighting for Mary's land, if that makes any sense. So the Holy Land was kind of the dominion of Christ himself. This is kind of reflects these feudal attitudes that, the Crusaders were kind of, the feudal army called up by Christ to defend his own territory. So if the Holy Land is Christ's lordship, his dominion as a feudal lord, kind of the greatest of all the feudal lords. In fact, that's really where the title of Christ as our Lord comes from. When you hear modern day evangelicals say Jesus is Lord, do they know that comes from the fact that, Jesus was kind of being compared or envisioned as sort of the top level of the feudal hierarchy back in the High Middle Ages. So the Holy Land is Christ's lordship, and the Teutonic Knights conceived of Prussia as Mary's lordship. So they were fighting on behalf of their lady, and this was her domain. In fact, I believe they even named they had like Marienborg was one of the castles. I guess you could say, wow, that's just kind of something they just made up, huh? And I mean, I would have to look more into the details as to why they conceived of those territories as hers. I mean, obviously there's nothing from the Bible to connect Mary to that territory or anything like that. But this is the way they conceived of it. And the Teutonic Knights had a special devotion to Mary, the Mother of God in that respect. So, but that's how they conceived of it. They were fighting for Mary's lands. Isn't that interesting? Anyway. So, let's see here. So Xenix is talking about how the Spanish, English, and French made their bids to the imperial title at different times. That is true. Tanner the Pan Man, I know you did a video on Reconquista, but what do you think about other scholars, Chris Tyerman too, calling it a myth entirely? And was it more motivated by money and opportunistic endeavors? I don't know. Did Christopher Tyerman call it a myth? I don't think that doesn't sound like the kind of sweeping judgment he would make. He tends to be a lot more subtle. But yeah, I'd be interested to see the quote on that. I mean, my position about the Reconquista has always been that, when you talk about the Reconquista of Spain, you are talking about a perspective that Latin Christians had, and the Iberian Christians themselves, especially, this is how they looked at it. So, I mean, that's what we're talking about. And so much of history is about getting into the heads of the people involved. And yeah, I mean, for the medieval Latin Christians of Spain and Portugal, they had this very clear concept of Reconquista, this idea that, okay, these lands had been taken by the Muslims from the Christians before, and we are in a process of regaining them. That's how they thought of it. That's where the term comes from. So calling it a myth, I mean, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the way this group of people looked at it, how they conceived of what they were doing. That's why they made deals with each other like ahead of time. Like the King of Aragon, the King of Castile, the King of Portugal would look at a map. Maybe they looked at a map. Maps weren't as big of a deal at this time, but in some way they got together and discussed which regions were going to go to who. Territories that were not yet conquered yet, but these were territories that were held by the Muslims at the time. And they just had this worldview that this was territory that was destined or should be retaken by a Christian power. And so they would kind of, to maintain peace with each other, they would come up with zones of conquest. And this points to that idea of Reconquista. Now, to be fair, the Muslims saw it differently. Of course they did. But, we can also look at their perspective when we're looking at the history. From their perspective, this was Al-Andalus, and it was lost to these Christian conquerors. The Christians didn't view it that way. They viewed it as, and they viewed themselves as having an attachment to the Visigothic monarchy. Especially the kings of Leon Castile kind of viewed themselves as, well, the King of Portugal, the King of Aragon, they're kind of junior partners, but we're the real heirs to the throne of King Roderick. That's how they viewed it. So the Portuguese and the Aragonese disagreed with that. Of course. Again, it's all about perspective. It's all about looking at how this particular group viewed things, and that's how you do history. So, Chris Jackson, how did regular people go on crusade? Did they generally go along with their lords, or were they going on their own? I guess they might not have the money to make the trip. A crusade, a pilgrimage was one thing, but a crusade was a military expedition. You would go attached to a particular commander. And that could be various subsets within that. Like you might be a part of this one knight's entourage, which was a part of this lord's small army, which was a part of this count's force who was attached to the King of France. So there were different layers to it necessarily because it was feudal. These were feudal armies most of the time, not always. But anyway, so yeah, especially if you were, if in fact there were people who went on crusade because they were commanded to do so by their lord or by whoever was above them in the feudal hierarchy. And that could be fairly poor people too. I mean, it just depended. Now, in theory, they were supposed to take a voluntary vow to go on crusade, but I'm sure there were people who went just, it's like, okay, well, if you're going to a high school and the whole school is going on a field trip somewhere or is going on a school trip across the country or whatever, you might be going because you're a part of that organization or group. Sometimes human beings participate in these larger activities because that's what their people are doing, the people around them are doing. Tom, any accounts that detail the first Crusaders' journey home to Europe after the Battle of Ashkelon? Not that I'm aware of, not in any great detail. And that's kind of interesting because I'm trying to think. I don't think we had any major chroniclers of the First Crusade who ended up going back. Fulcher of Chartres stayed. The author of the Gesta Francorum seems to have stayed or maybe died soon after the events of the First Crusade. The chaplain of Raymond of Toulouse, he would have stayed, surely, because Raymond IV stayed. And we don't have any chronicles from the camps of the two main leaders who went back home, Robert of Flanders or Robert of Normandy, which that is a huge loss. I really wish we had something from the entourage of Robert of Normandy. since he was William the Conqueror's son, that would be interesting to have another Norman perspective. All the Norman accounts we have two main Norman accounts that both come from the South Italian Normans. It would be really interesting to have one from the Normandy Normans. So let's get some more questions here. You guys always have lots of good questions. I appreciate that. Alexander, have you thought of making one about Birger Jarl's crusade in Finland and the Swedish crusades against Novgorod? That would be interesting. Again, so much stuff to do, so little time, Someday I'll get to all of this. It's funny, when I talk to people about what I do, about how I have a YouTube channel about history, people always ask me, and this is people who aren't big history fans. These are people who I meet in regular life, will ask me, "Oh, are you worried you're going to run out of stuff to make, like topics to make videos about?" Least of my worries, right? Okay. Here's an interesting question from Lambert. Oh, and before we get into this, because I know I'm going to ramble a lot about this one, this Friday, which is, I need to change my calendar, Friday the 5th at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, 8 p.m. Central Time, you guys can check out a stream with me and Rand Brown. We're going to talk about the 100 Years' War, basically. It's going to be kind of like Ask Me Anything about King Henry V of England and the Battle of Agincourt. Rand is an expert on that. So that would be a good thing to talk to him about. I hope you guys will check that out with us. So getting back into the Friday evening streams for the next 3 months as we do the last round of promotion for Knights of the Cross. We're raising money right now to make the second and final episode of Knights of the Cross, at least for now. The project will be basically over at that point. So join us. Go check out knightsofthecross.com. Let me present that here. So there we go. knightsofthecross.com. Check that out, guys. And Lambert's excellent question. What was the court split between Baldwin III and Melisande during their contentious relationship? Was it anything like the split between when Baldwin IV's regency was being decided? Good question. I will say this. I remember when I was talking to Stephen Donachie once about this particular issue. And Stephen Donachie is a scholar I respect quite a bit. I think he's very knowledgeable about the Crusader states, especially the politics of the Crusader states. And he felt that the way that this split or this feud is often described by historians is kind of overblown. That it wasn't, that it was a bit more of a squabble than a war. There was some fighting involved. That's kind of how medieval aristocrats did things. They like to kind of fight it out a little bit. But that it wasn't really a split that really threatened the integrity of the kingdom. I believe that's what he said. I hope I'm not misquoting him. That was the impression I got from it. And I can see where he's coming from on that. I think that's pretty fair. Oftentimes when we are looking back on these things, it's just kind of such a different, it's a little bit different than the more, just kind of the way things are not resolved that way necessarily in politics in our world today. But that it was, it was a power struggle between them. Melisande did not want to let her son just rule the whole kingdom on his own. And Baldwin said, sorry, Mom, I'm going to do it, and you're going to have to go along with it. And that's what happened. I don't think she really had a chance. At the end of the day, the kingdom needed its. I've got 3 different things I'm drinking here, guys. At the end of the day, the kingdom needed its king, and that was recognized by everybody. And it was kind of a matter of what kind of settlement, how things were going to be settled between Melisande and Baldwin III. So, okay, let's do some more questions here. Xenix. The Teutonic devotion to the Virgin is a rather interesting topic and could be looked into more. Isn't it even reflected in the official name of the order? Yes, it is. And the name of the order, let's see if we can look that up real quick. It's pretty long from what I remember. Teutonic order. The Order of Brothers of the German House of St. Mary in Jerusalem. So, okay, so that makes sense. The institution where the order was founded was named for the Mother of God, for Saint Mary, as she was often referred to in the High Middle Ages. But she's not called that as often in modern Catholicism. She's more the Virgin Mary. The Blessed Mother is a common title for her today. Virgin Mary was also, more the Virgin, the Holy Virgin. You hear that a lot in the medieval, language as well. Xenix has a good one here. Have you read Thomas Asbridge's The First Crusade? The very subtitle, The Roots of Conflict Between Christianity and Islam, and other comments appear to be typical pop history trashing of the Crusades. Yeah, I respect Asbridge. I think he's a good scholar. I remember also being struck by that subtitle as well, because clearly it's not the case. I mean, in terms of a wider conflict between the Christian world and the Muslim world in the Middle Ages, that obviously began far earlier than the First Crusade. Obviously, there was conflict between the Byzantines and the Muslims in one area. The Franks were fighting the Muslims, at the Battle of Tours. Obviously, Spain had a long-running conflict. There was the Asturians battling the Umayyads in Spain. So clearly, this is not correct. The First Crusade is indeed kind of a central act within this larger play, if you will. So, I think that's, and I remember kind of talking about that. I read that book for the first time when I was in college, and I was doing a history degree, and talking to one of my professors. I remember mentioning that to him and saying, isn't this kind of a crazy title? And he said, yeah, that does kind of introduce a lot of questions. So the book itself is a really good history. In terms of just like getting at the facts of things. And I don't feel like it's a particularly preachy book. I've used it myself from the source in many videos. And it's just a very solid rundown of the First Crusade. I would recommend it just for that. I don't really remember if it kind of casts the First Crusade as some kind of, and I think that it's really erroneous to view the First Crusade as some kind of, it's one element in this wider conflict, but it didn't really launch any kind of major change. And what it did was it changed the theater. Now there's kind of this battle in the heart of the Islamic world between Christendom and Islam, but it definitely didn't change the nature of it. And in fact, the thing that's interesting too, Muslims tended to respect Christian opponents who were more committed to fighting for their religion. They they mistrusted Frederick II, for example. They kind of have negative things to say about him, partly because he seemed to be kind of disingenuous about his Christian faith, at least according to some of the Muslim chroniclers we have. So, okay. Tom, During your visit to the Holy Land, were you able to visit any of the first Crusader sites like Antioch, Nicaea, Edessa, Marat al-Numan? All that was pretty far away from where I was. I was pretty much right in kind of what is today Israel, which, that's the site of mostly where the Kingdom of Jerusalem was, kind of the old Roman province of Palestine. So yeah, that was all too far away for me to look at. I did go to Constantinople when I got a chance to go to Turkey, and I visited Istanbul. So okay, guys. Well, I think that's probably good for today. Let's call it a day for now, and join us on Friday. At Friday the 5th, we will be talking about 100 Years of War and Henry V, and just taking questions on that. And also join me here again next Tuesday for more Coffee and the Crusades, and I will talk to you guys then.